even among Japanese people, I want to be the best Japanese person. For me, it's not really about reaching a goal. It's just knowing that there's still more to go, right? I enjoy pushing the boundaries, getting better and better, always learning new things. And so that's just what I keep doing.
Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, wanted to ask you two questions. Firstly, o genki desu ka?
元気ですよ。元気ですよ。コールさんは
はい。元気です。
いいですね。いいですね。
Yeah, hi. Okay. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, how's the pitch accent sounding? Decent?
Very, very good. Spot on.
Actually good. Okay.
I didn't notice anything sounded weird, so that's the best sign that it was going well.
Sweet. And we'll talk about pitch accents, stuff like that.
Sounds great.
As we get further into the podcast, I want to have the second question. So the second question I want to ask you is, what's the most fascinating thing that you've learned about the Japanese language recently? Because I've seen you tweet out a lot of interesting things on your Twitter about the Japanese language. It seems like you're always learning something new. What's the most recent that you can think of?
Okay, well, one insight that kind of struck me yesterday is that, so in Japanese, nowadays, there's a lot of English words being borrowed into Japanese. And it's something that foreigners who are learning Japanese kind of complain about a lot. Like, recently, you'll hear Japanese people talking about the bijon of their company, the vision that they have for their company, or the purpose that they have for the company. Like all these things that until like literally a couple of years ago, you would never hear in Japanese. So it's kind of like this influx of English into Japanese that foreigners complain about because it's like watering down Japanese, right? And making it more Englishy. But what I kind of realize is that Japanese people, when they do this, they're not just borrowing an English word. They do this when they want a new concept that, like, basically there's this new concept that popped up. It never existed before in the history of Japan. And so they need some new word for it. And what they do nowadays is they just borrow the English word that is kind of closest to it. And so to them, it's not really the equivalent of, oh, there's this word in English, now we're going to import it into Japanese. It's more like, okay, us Japanese people made up a new concept. We need a label for it. And so it's most convenient to use an English label, because if they actually stuck a Japanese word onto it that already existed, it would be confusing whether they mean the original Japanese meaning or this new specific meaning for this new context. So it's actually kind of convenient in that sense when you kind of view it that way.
What's the most closely related term or definition to vision and purpose in Japanese?
So vision, I mean, there's words like mokyō, which means like a goal that you have, broadly speaking. There's like yume, which is just your dream that you could have. There's a lot of similar words like that. But for example, in this particular case, when they say bijon, they mean specifically like in the context of a company, what is the company's like purpose for existing and what is its goal that it's on track on. So you'd never use it like for your own individual life or something like that.
Got you. Sweet. Very, very cool. I'm interested to learn more. Now, for those who don't know, me and Matt actually came into contact because he saw my video about trying to learn Japanese in 30 days, which is absolutely unrealistic and was definitely clickbait. But I did my best in learning about like 10 to 15% is what I could understand. Something I want to clarify with that video that I never clarified was like that 10 to 15% was like mostly incomplete sentences. The amount of complete sentences I could understand, I don't know. It'd be closer to like 5% or 2%. But that is how Matt found me. And then I think I saw your tweet or...
Yeah. Can I actually say a little bit? When I found that, by the way, just making sure what I'm looking... Looks like my audio is like quieter than yours on this thing, but...
Oh, it's totally fine.
Oh, okay.
It'll be totally fine.
Yeah, the kind of funny story behind that video on my end is that when I saw the title and thumbnail, I was like, oh god, this is going to be so fucking cringy. Like, there's a lot of videos like this.
Yeah.
And basically, in the world of language learning, there's a lot of bad advice, like way more bad advice than good advice. And so for me, as someone who has kind of dedicated my online presence to giving what I consider to be good language learning advice, hearing other people give bad language learning advice is always like, just painful for me. And so,
Yeah.
especially when it's somebody who's like new to language learning, they haven't been doing it a long time. Generally, when they make this type of video, it's just complete garbage. So that was what I was expecting clicking on this. But I was actually pleasantly surprised because although you started off the way most people start off, by just the end of this like short 30-day period, you had pretty much figured out all the most efficient methods, like using Anki spaced repetition,
Mhm.
actually using native input as your main source of learning. So I was really impressed by how quickly you were able to kind of hone in and find the most effective techniques.
Thank you.
A lot of people go
Yeah,
years without arriving at that. So
I guess I just got lucky with finding the right content to consume, and that one video where what I've learned featured you, and then he also had another video on language learning about comprehensive input. Realizing that that was the most effective method early on, yeah, definitely a game changer. But since then, so I made that video, and I still kept learning for quite a while. Up until the end of last year. Then I moved here to Austin, Texas. And ever since I've been here, my routine's kind of changed. And it's just like learning Japanese has not fit as well into my daily routine. But I know that's just an excuse. Hopefully,
it happens.
this podcast will be a motivator for me to start again. And before we get into learning Japanese or learning a language, I want to know more about you and your background. So I understand that you lived in Japan for some time.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about, and how did that shape the person you are today? Like, what did you learn from experiencing such a different culture from America? And also, how much of that inspired you to learn languages? Is that where it came from?
Yeah. So I'll give a super quick overview of my story, and then we can dive deeper into any particular portions that you're interested in. But basically, when I was a freshman in high school, that's when I first became interested in Japanese. Up until that point, I was not interested in languages or foreign cultures at all. I was like one of the worst kids in the Spanish class that I was forced to take. And it was through watching anime, similar story to lots of other people. I watched anime, thought it was super sweet, reminded me of my childhood because when I was a kid, I loved Dragon Ball, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! And it just kind of, just something clicked. I was like, I want to learn this language. This sounds really sweet. So I started learning Japanese and did normal stuff that normal people did. Didn't really get very far. And then I took a 3-week trip to Japan about 2 years into learning Japanese. It was just a trip through my school. It was kind of just like a tour around Japan, stay with the host family, do sightseeing and stuff. And that was like the most exciting and fun experience of my life. So that was when I really decided, okay, I'm going to get really serious about this and really try to get fluent in Japanese. So as soon as I got back from that 3-week trip, I started kind of just doing all Japanese all the time, totally dedicating my life to it. I would pretty much try to avoid English and just do like as much as I possibly could in Japanese. Just like reading books, watching movies. I try to make Japanese friends. All really intensive immersion. And about 6 months into this self-immersion approach, I went back to Japan for a study abroad in high school. I was like a junior in high school at this point. And I was in Japan for about 6 months, but I actually had a really shitty time because I wasn't very good at Japanese yet at this point. I'd only been kind of working hard on Japanese for 6 months. So I ended up not really being able to make friends. I was pretty isolated, didn't get along with my host family. And a lot of this, I mainly blame it on my lack of language ability and my circumstances, but it was also a lot of my fault. I was kind of a brat as well. I don't blame my host family for not liking me at the time when I think back to it. But yeah,
What's something you did that you think pissed them off?
So basically, well, first of all, I was really bad about like helping out. Like in the kind of household I grew up in, it's kind of like if you want me to do something, ask me to do it. And if you don't ask me to do something, well, I'm just going to be minding my own business. Whereas they were kind of expecting me to be like, hey, can I help you cook? Can I help you with the dishes? And kind of help out. So that was one thing. Also, on the weekends, they were like, hey, what do you want to do? Do you want to go sightseeing? You want to go visit some shrine? And I was like, no, I just want to like study Anki cards in my room. Like, I just want to study Japanese in my room and practice reading books. And so I was kind of like the most boring host kid ever as well. So I think that was kind of part of it. But yeah, because of that, it was actually supposed to originally be a 10-month study abroad. But after 6 months, I got so depressed, I just said, fuck this. And I decided to come back early. And so I came back to America. I was about 1 year at that point. I had 6 months before going to Japan, 6 months in Japan of like hardcore working on my Japanese. So I was starting to finally get somewhere that maybe, I felt like I was like halfway to fluency maybe. And so I didn't want to give up. So I decided that I was going to continue learning Japanese, get really fluent, and then one day I'd go back to Japan and kind of like redeem myself, have the experience that I wasn't able to have. So I continued learning Japanese super hardcore. I did that for like another couple years, and after I was a couple years into this hardcore immersion, I started to really be fluent in the language. And then I eventually transferred into a 4-year university where there was many Japanese foreign exchange students. So I'd just hang out, and it was almost like I was in Japan. I'd hang out with these Japanese kids all the time, and we'd only speak Japanese. So that really got my speaking level a lot higher. And then when I was about 5 years into this immersion approach, I was at a point where, I was at a level that it's very, very rare for a foreigner to reach in Japanese in terms of fluency. And most of that I'd actually reached outside Japan, because I'd only really been in Japan for 6 months. And when I got back from Japan, I still sucked at Japanese, essentially. So that's kind of my story, is that I got really fluent in Japanese largely outside Japan. Of course, being in Japan for those 6 months helped, but it was mostly, outside Japan. And then I started my YouTube channel, and I've been doing kind of YouTube, talking about language learning on YouTube, talking about Japanese for the past 5 years. And I still haven't gone back to Japan since that 6-month study abroad, which was actually exactly 10 years ago. And so I'm actually finally moving back to Japan next month, which is pretty exciting. And I will finally get to have that experience that I missed out on as a high schooler when I sucked at Japanese.
So they are letting foreigners in now.
So I'm actually technically going as a student. I applied for a study abroad as kind of like a workaround. But I think right as of this filming, to go as a tourist, you have to go as part of like a packaged tour, which is really expensive, and you don't get a lot of freedom. Hopefully within the next couple months, tourists will be able to start going over as well.
So you mentioned you were into anime. What are some of your favorites? What's your top 3?
That's hard. I'm always bad at picking favorites.
I'm also terrible at this.
Let's see. The first ones that come to mind are like Death Note. And part of these, it's related to the age when you first watched them, right? So like Death Note was one of the first shows I ever watched. So it had a really big impact on me. Then like Hunter x Hunter, Full Metal Alchemist, Bakemonogatari. So many shows.
I know you weren't there for too long, but how has learning Japanese and also living there for a little while shaped your perception of not only Americans, but just like how other cultures interact with each other, and how important do you think this is for people to experience different cultures? How did it shape you as a person?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've pretty much spent my whole entire adult life with Japanese, right? Like I've spent almost as much time in Japanese as English since, the age of like 17. So for me, I don't even really feel fully American. Like sometimes if I like meet a random American person on the street, I feel like I don't even know what to talk to them about, because so much of what I do in my spare time is relating to Japanese culture, Japanese events, Japanese media. And so in a way, I feel like I'm like a phony, like pretending to be American when I'm like talking to Americans sometimes. So yeah, it's totally shaped my whole life and personality. Like my girlfriend's Japanese, of course, I wouldn't have met her. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to compare what my life would have been like without it. But yeah, also, Japan is a very particular culture. America is a very particular culture. So I have a really interesting perspective on these two cultures. But that doesn't necessarily mean, I understand, Chinese culture, European culture, anything like that. So I don't necessarily feel like, I'm some like super sophisticated person that has like a deeper cultural knowledge than everyone else. But yeah, so one thing that I do think that I think a lot of people don't realize getting into language learning is that it's to really get to a point where you have a meaningful level of ability and you can really have a deep inside look into the culture is a really big commitment that takes a lot of time. And so I think a lot of times people want the message of like, yeah, everyone should learn a foreign language. Everyone should go and learn a foreign culture. Otherwise, you're like uneducated. But part of me thinks, well, if you want to get more than a surface level view into another culture, you need to spend so much time with that language, with that culture, that that's a huge commitment. And it means all that time is time that you're not spending doing other things. So obviously I think it's amazingly enriching to dive deep into a foreign culture and learn another language, but I also don't necessarily think it's for everyone.
Interesting. I haven't heard that take before. Usually it's always go experience as much of the world as you possibly can, immerse yourself in as many different cultures as you can to gain more open-mindedness. And
Well, there's definitely a
You,
trade-off between depth and breadth. And I
mm,
think the other thing that's important to recognize is that when you're learning a foreign language, how difficult it is or how much time it's going to take greatly depends on what your native language is. So, as an English speaker, if you want to learn Spanish, that literally is going to take like 1/5 of the time it's going to take you to reach a similar level in Japanese, because Japanese is completely different, completely foreign. And so I think a lot of times the people that are kind of recommending this, like, oh, enjoy a broad menu of foreign languages and foreign cultures, a lot of times they're mostly cultures that are like European and similar to one another. Like, yeah, you can learn French and German and Spanish to a pretty high level in a couple years if you work hard, but it takes the same amount of time to get to a good level in just Japanese or just Chinese
mm,
if you want to dive
mm,
into one of those cultures. And the other thing is, I know a lot of these people, to be frank, that are kind of like language connoisseurs. They've studied multiple, like a bunch of languages, but from my point of view, they really only have a surface level understanding of the languages and the cultures that they've learned. Like, I know this is depends on the culture as well, but Japan has this really strong like insider versus outsider mentality. And so they love to be really great hosts, and they love to welcome guests and treat guests amazingly well and give them great service. And so if you just want to go to Japan, learn a little bit of Japanese and speak to them in your kind of broken Japanese, they'll love that and they'll treat you amazingly and it'll be a great time. But that's not really going to give you a deep understanding of what being Japanese is really like and how Japanese people see the world. To get to that point, you have to get to the point where you can eavesdrop on their conversations and see what they're saying when they don't know you're listening. And that takes a
mm-hmm.
lot of time, a lot of practice.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know how much studying you've done in linguistics overall, but I made a video where I argued for a linguistic concept that probably already existed. I'm almost positive it was confirmed that it does. Basically, I said something along the lines of, so do Japanese people see an apple differently? Like look at an apple and they see it differently because the word that they associate apple with is ringo. Do you know exactly what that linguistic theory or concept is called, or do you agree with it?
I'm pretty sure I did take a couple linguistics classes at college, and I'm pretty sure there is a theory just like this.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be like the warp Sapir hypothesis or something. Don't quote me on that, but
Okay.
I think there's definitely a lot of truth to it. But it depends on the concept. Like if you're talking about like the word apple in particular, like apple versus ringo is apple in Japanese. I mean, maybe it's slightly different in the sense of like when an American hears the word apple, the image that pops into our head is like a red delicious apple, right? Whereas maybe the prototypical apple in the mind of a Japanese person is a different type of apple. I'm not really sure. But I think that concept probably comes into play a lot more with less tangible ideas. Like, for example, if you take the English word love and compare that to the closest Japanese word, which might be I, right? Definitely, Japanese people's conception of I is completely different than American people's conception of love. And I definitely think that changes the way that we see the world. In fact, there's a lot of times where there's a lot of words in English that just don't exist in Japanese, and there's a lot of Japanese words that don't exist in English. And having Japanese installed on my head makes me see Japanese concepts even when I'm speaking English.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, there's a word in Japanese that it's a single word that basically means instantaneous reply. It's sokuto. And this is used when basically you ask someone for something, and they basically, one example would be they say no without even thinking about it, right? You're like, hey, do you want to go to the prom with me? No. Then you would say sokuto, like that was an instant response. It means like, oh, you didn't even think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how I can't believe you gave me an instant responce. And it's kind of funny in Japanese. It's generally like kind of like a joke when someone says that. And so a lot of times in English, when someone instantly responds to me, I want to be like sokuto, but we don't have a word for that. And if
Yeah.
I can say that in 3 words, like you didn't even think about it, right? Or that was an instant response. But it's not as funny when it's like 4 or 5 words, right? It's funny in Japanese because it's one word and it's one particular concept that you can point to directly.
Mm. That makes me think a lot about how the words shape just the culture and the way people interact with each other. Definitely. I want to rewind real quick because I didn't realize when you said it, but you are talking about how friendly Japanese are to foreigners, and they'll host you and be super nice about it. From what I've heard, is they hate foreigners. Is there a certain instance in which they don't like foreigners that I'm not aware of, or
So I definitely don't think that. Well, so of course the first thing we gotta get out of the way is that Japan is a country of over 100 million people. So there's all sorts of Japanese people. There's definitely racist Japanese people out there that exist, just like there's racist Americans and racist people from every country. And so we always got to have that caveat whenever we're talking about like Japanese people as if they're like one monolithic thing.
yeah,
Because, each one of my Japanese friends is a completely different person with completely different like beliefs and stuff. And so what I've kind of heard, well, what my kind of experience is that, the average Japanese person is very curious about foreigners, right? Foreigners are something that they see on TV and movies. Like Japanese people love American movies, right? They love Harry Potter and all the same movies that we do. And so kind of like a foreign looking person, like a white looking person or a black looking person is kind of like something they've only seen in the movies. So my interaction with Japanese people is that they're very interested and curious, but also most Japanese people have very low English ability. And so they assume that foreigners aren't going to be able to speak Japanese. And so talking to a foreigner means trying to use their crappy English that has been rusting since the end of high school with the last time they studied it. And so that's a very scary experience. So sometimes Japanese people will be like, "Oh no, a foreigner, get away from me. I don't want to have to speak English. Like I have nightmares from high school of cramming English, vocab before a test." That's like what English is for them. And so there's definitely that. And then there's also like, yeah, it might be hard to get an apartment in Japan if you're a foreigner, because Japanese people don't know how long you're going to be in the country for, right? What if you suddenly leave the country and then they don't get the rent? Or what if they can't communicate with you? Or what if you don't understand Japanese manners and you're really rude and they don't know how to, you know, if it's a Japanese person, they can kind of understand that, they share all the same common sense, and so they're gonna act predictably. Whereas a foreigner is kind of just this like black box, like who knows what they're gonna do? They're from a totally different country. So there's a little bit of that, but in my experience, Japanese people definitely don't hate foreigners. They're just kind of maybe sometimes apprehensive due to just how unknown they are, and they don't know what it's going to mean for them.
Mm.
But in my experience, when I meet a foreigner and I talk to them in Japanese and they realize that I'm like totally fluent in Japanese, then they're generally super excited to talk to me, super happy. They're really curious, like, why do you like Japan? What made you study Japanese? What do you like? How is Japan different than America? So in my experience, as long as you get past the language barrier, then generally almost every Japanese person I've ever met is super happy to talk to me.
Mm. Yeah, I'm trying to get to that point as well. I would love to be somewhat fluent by the time I first visit Japan, and I've thought for a while now about living there for several months, if possible. I don't know how the whole process is going to look, but that's way down the line. That's years down the line from right now and what I'm doing. But when you visited Japan, what was the coolest piece of their culture that you experienced that was very different from America?
I mean, to be honest, the thing that had the biggest impact on me was just the scenery. Like, in general, Japan is not a lot like what you see in anime. But the one thing that is just like anime is how everything looks. Like, everything really looks like you just entered into an anime. And for me, that was like the coolest thing ever. Like, my best memories from Japan are just like riding my bike home from school and just looking at the scenery, looking at the mountains off in the distance and the Japanese shops with Japanese written everything on it, and the Japanese architecture with the special roofs that they have. And so that still, like, that's one of the things I'm looking most forward to going back to Japan, being able to just experience that again. It's like the air is just a little bit different there. It just feels different. And there's something really cool about that.
Yeah. So, I feel that way even in some places in America. Like, I can just feel not necessarily the architecture, but the energy of a place.
Yeah,
I think definitely is extremely important. I can think of when I visited San Diego, hopped off the plane there when I was living in Las Vegas for a few months. I just felt like it felt different. Like there's a different vibe to the entire place, and I'm interested to feel what that feels like in Japan. So you started learning because of your love for anime. Is there any other intrinsic motivators for diving so deeply into learning this language? Like, what motivates you to keep going, to constantly be learning new things about it? Like, what is it other than just, oh, it'd be nice to live there and be fluent
Yeah,
and
yeah.
understanding anime?
So my motivation when I first started was very different than my motivation today. My motivation when I first started, a lot of it had to do, I mean, a lot of it was that I liked anime. I thought it sounded super cool. I was just inherently very intrigued by it. But also, there was a component where I was in high school and I wasn't exactly popular in high school. And I didn't really feel like I had like a place that I belonged, I didn't really have a very close group of friends or anything. When I was in middle school, I was actually really into skateboarding. And that kind of became my entire identity, right? I'd hang out with the other kids who skateboarded. We were the skaters. And that kind of gave me my place within the miniature society that is, your middle school. And skaters were pretty cool back at that particular time, so it was kind of nice. And then suddenly I go to high school and skateboarding's not cool anymore. And all the skaters have now become stoners and they're kind of druggies and everyone else kind of looks at them weird. And suddenly everyone thinks I'm a stoner because I hang out with them, even though I had never smoked weed before. And so I kind of like moved away from skateboarding, but didn't really have any new identity yet. I didn't have anything to replace it with, and didn't. It just kind of felt lost at high school. So for me, I kind of think I grabbed onto Japanese as like a new identity. I kind of got this idea in my head of like, oh, if I go to Japan and I'm this like foreigner there, then everyone will love me and my life will be way better. And so I kind of convinced myself that Japan was like heaven on earth, and if I just went to Japan, it would fix all my problems. And America sucked, and that's why I was not having fun at high school. So I kind of it was kind of like this escapism where it allowed me to blame all my inner problems on something external and come up with a convenient solution to that. And so that really actually fell apart when I was on that study abroad in Japan for 6 months, because it became very clear that Japan is not heaven on earth. It's just a normal country. And in fact, some of my host family situations were like pretty rough. Like my first host family, I actually had a couple different host families. The first host family was like a single mother who was like doing whatever she could to make ends meet, and she was also like not very nice. And then one of my other host families, the dad, I would never see him because he would work so late and come home like after I went to bed and leave the house before I like woke up. And so I kind of saw like some of the darker parts of Japan. And so definitely kind of broke that illusion. But I guess when I got back from Japan, something about that, all the time I'd spent already with that point, with the language and with the country, and that initial spark that I had with the anime, something just told me that I should keep going and that I wanted to keep doing it. Also, it was kind of like sunk cost bias as well, like sunk cost
Mm.
fallacy, where it's kind of like I already put so much time into this. Like if I quit now, it's all going to go to waste. So I was kind of like,
Yeah.
I had internal pressure to like convince myself that it was what I wanted to do. And so I just kind of had that momentum and kept going. But for the past few years, then yeah, it's totally changed because I mean, since like 5 years ago, I've already been really fluent in Japanese, right? And most people, when they reach the level that I'm at, they're kind of like satisfied. They kind of have this mindset of like, okay, I beat the game, no need to improve now. Like I'm the king. And there's been moments where I kind of fall into that, but ultimately, the way that I've always thought about language is that native speakers are the gold standard, right? So this actually makes language learning very different than almost any other skill, because, for example, if you're going to be a musician, right, there's no such thing as a native speaker in like guitar or like piano, right? Everyone who learns piano like starts learning from zero, like at an age where they're already conscious and has to go through every single step. Whereas language, native speakers, it's kind of like by the time we realize that we exist and we like have an ego, we're already like a native speaker of the language. Our pronunciation's perfect. We can speak grammatically. Of course, we have to go through school to like really reach an adult like level, but for the most part, we have almost godlike language ability without even trying. So it almost be like imagine a world where there's this like species of an alternate species of human that is just born with like amazing piano abilities that you could work your whole life for and like maybe get close to, but maybe not because they're just so beyond like the normal human. They're just like the piano race. And so you're like learning piano as a normal human, always like seeing that there's this other species that is like way better than you and you're probably never going to be able to catch up to them, but maybe you can get kind of close if you work your ass off for like 2 decades. So that's like kind of what it's like with language learning, because I'm learning Japanese and I might get really good at Japanese, but then there's this whole country of 100 million people who are still better at Japanese than me, even though I've been like working my ass off for 5 years and I'm like in the 99.99th percentile of foreigners, right? And
they need. I'm sorry for cutting you off,
no,
but
no,
they
no.
need to make an anime about you, just like the whole come up story of like, I need to become the best.
I mean, I think a
Like that
language
would
learning
fit. That
anime
would fit in.
might be pretty dope. I've never
Yeah,
heard of
that
that.
would fit. That would fit an anime concept perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, there's cooking animes. There should be a language
Right.
learning anime for sure.
Right.
But yeah, so for me, I mean, when I compare myself to Japanese people, I see that I'm still not as good as they are. You know,
Mhm.
I have a really good accent, but I don't have a literally perfect accent. You know, I can express myself very, very freely, but not as freely as a native speaker who, you know, no matter how tired or how drunk they are, they can still speak like completely, perfectly, articulately. And even among native speakers, there's a hierarchy of ability, right? Like all native speakers can write an essay, most can, but you know, for take English speakers, right? Most people can't write like Hemingway, right? So even within native speakers, there's people who are beyond the rest, and I look at those people and think, wow, imagine how cool it would be if I could be as articulate and as eloquent as some of those people. So I think in a way, even if I got to like a native like level, I might still want to continue improving my ability because I'd be looking at even among Japanese people, I want to be the best Japanese person. And
Mhm.
so for me, it's not really about reaching a goal. It's just knowing that there's still more to go. And I would rather just like, I guess it's kind of just the mindset of like wanting to complete your Pokédex, right? It's like some people, they play Pokemon, they beat the Elite Four and they play for a little bit more and then they move on to a new game. Where some people, they just want to literally 100% complete a video game, unlock every single little achievement, catch every single Pokemon. And I guess that's just my mindset with Japanese, and that's just what I enjoy doing. Right, I enjoy pushing the boundaries, getting better and better, always learning new things, and so that's just what I keep doing.
That's a good analogy with the Pokédex. Do you think there's like a video game, an eventual end, like you've done everything and seen everything and learned everything that you possibly can?
No, I mean maybe if our lifespans were like 1,000 years long, maybe. But I don't think, not realistically in one human lifetime. Although there are
Mm-hmm.
diminishing returns. Like for me, every year basically, I've improved in a way less than I had the previous year. In just the sense that, like, for example, if you learn the most common 300 words in Japanese, that actually covers 80% of all words used in daily conversation. And just in 300, right? And then if you learn
Mm-hmm.
another 1,000 words after that, that gets you to like 90%. And then if you learn another 1,000 after that, that gets you to like 92% or something. And so to get to like 99%, then you need like 10,000 words. And then to go from like 99 to 99.99, you need like 50,000 words. So it just, there's this like really steep exponential curve of diminishing returns. And that's not just for like vocabulary, it's for all aspects, right? For like cultural knowledge, for, you know, your sensibilities in the language, your sense of humor, you know. So I think it gets to the point where you're like so close to 100 that it's not even really worth trying to improve it anymore. But I don't think there's any true such thing as like you've 100% maxed it out.
Yeah, sounds like the leveling up system in RuneScape. I don't know if you've ever played, but you
A
know, once
long
you hit
time ago.
level 92, you're halfway to 99.
Mm, yep.
So I know all about that type of learning, but I guess a lot of learning is similar to that. What do you think? Well, I'm sure it's been proven, but I want you to explain, why is it that those first few years of being a baby and being immersed in the language puts you so much ahead of someone who's even studied it for their whole lives but started when they were, let's say, a teenager?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And that's actually something I think a lot about. And it's something there's a lot of debate about. So basically, one hypothesis that a lot of people have had, and it's almost impossible to prove either way, is let's say you take a 20-year-old and you make them do exactly what a baby does, which is basically, first of all, be exposed to the language for almost 24 hours a day nonstop, and then second of all, they don't do anything to interfere with that process, right? They're not forced to speak early and like contrive output or anything. They're not really studying or using the language. They're entirely leaving it up to their unconscious mind to kind of acquire for them. And they're doing this for 24 hours a day, maybe for a couple of years. What would their results be? Would their results be equal to a baby? Would it be worse? Would it maybe even be better because they have a more developed mind? Uh, I think it's really hard to say, but there's actually some people who've made a pretty interesting case that actually the results would be very similar to an infant. There's actually a school in Thailand called the AUA, and they have this program called Automatic Language Growth that was started by this guy named J. Marvin Brown in the early 90s. And so what this guy did is he made a class to teach Thai to native English speakers, the Thai language in Thailand. And what he did is he had two native speakers stand in front of the classroom and just speak to each other and to the students in Thai and try to make that speech that they're doing somehow comprehensible. So they'd use lots of props and they'd draw on the board and they'd interact with each other. So they try to make it so that even if you didn't understand the words or the grammar, you would still know the message that they were saying. And that's basically what babies do, right? They understand the input from context clues and things like that, and then their mind kind of figures it out for them. And in this method, he actually forbid the students from speaking early because he believed that forcing yourself to speak too early actually makes you build bad habits and kind of damages the natural acquisition process. And he also forbid people from studying, from taking notes, from asking questions, basically from intellectualizing the language in any way at all. Because he believed that basically if you want infant-like results, you have to do it like an infant and leave it all up to your unconscious mind, which is more powerful than your conscious mind. And apparently the results were like really incredible. And a lot of the students went on to reach a native like level in just a matter of years after getting like I think it was, like around 2,000 hours of input in this classroom over the course of a year. And then after that, they just go and live in Thailand for a couple of years. And then they'd sound almost like a native speaker. So when I read the book by this person, J. Marvin Brown, that really had a big influence on my thinking because it made me think, wow, maybe it's not something different about the brain of an infant. Maybe it's just about the methods. Because most of the time, the way an adult goes about learning a language is not anything like what I just described, right? We study, we think, we intellectualize. We also don't spend nearly that many hours with the language. And so I think it's possible that that's the case. Although that being said, I haven't met anyone who actually is a living example of this, right? Like the J. Marvin Brown, he actually passed away in 2003, I think. And most of the work he did was in the 90s and the 80s and the 90s. And so you kind of just have to take his word for it. I haven't met anyone who actually reached a native-like level through this extreme all-input approach.
Yeah.
So maybe it's possible, maybe it's not. Unfortunately, it's really hard to test because, how do you get a test subject and control their lives for 2,000 hours? It's like not really feasible.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to your method. And what you now have is a website called Refold. I think that's what the method is called as well. And I want to talk about it, get into it. And I guess we can just start off with you giving kind of an overall few sentence idea of this type of language learning.
Yeah, so I generally refer to this style of language learning as input-based language learning. And the idea kind of stems initially from an idea by the linguist called Stephen Krashen, who actually who greatly influenced the other linguist I just mentioned, J. Marvin Brown. Stephen Krashen had this really fundamental idea that basically there's two different ways that we can go about trying to attain linguistic ability. One of them is what he called learning, and the other one is what he called acquisition. So acquisition is how we acquired our native language as babies. It's an unconscious process where parts of your brain, almost kind of like a machine learning algorithm, if you've ever looked into how those work, it just takes in lots of input, matches it up with contextual meaning, and derives its own understanding of how the grammar works, how the sound system works, how the meaning works. And it's something that happens entirely unconsciously. And so you could be watching a movie and just feel like you're just enjoying a story. You don't feel like you're doing any learning, but outside of your consciousness and your unconscious, inside of your unconscious mind, it's actually kind of analyzing the language and improving its understanding of how it works. And then when you go to speak the language, you actually benefit from that understanding that your unconscious mind built. Basically, that's the source of our intuition, right? So there's lots of, in English, right? There's lots of grammar rules where unless you're like a linguist who's specifically studied English grammar at like a college level, there's going to be lots of English grammar rules where if I ask you to explain it, you would have no idea how it's actually working, but you can instantly say whether it's right or wrong and you use it yourself like without even trying. So that's the result of this acquisition. It's this entirely unconscious, intuitive process. Separate from that, there's learning, which is what we generally do in school, where you're kind of memorizing vocab, memorizing grammar and vocabulary. And there's kind of this assumption that basically you can learn language in the same way that you could learn like a physical skill, like playing piano or something, right? Like just memorize all these grammar formulas, memorize this vocab, and then just practice it enough and you'll be fluent. But it just turns out that just doesn't work in reality. And if you can try this and you can practice and drill all these grammar rules for as long as you want, and they never get automatic, they never get intuitive, because that's just not how the human brain learns language. And so ultimately, if you want to actually reach fluency, you have to figure out how to engage this process of acquisition and not rely on learning, because learning just doesn't work. That's why you can take 6 years of a language in high school and middle school or college and still you'll suck. You'll never be fluent. And so refold is structured in such a way that all the real action happens through getting input and through natural acquisition, but you're still leveraging your conscious mind in a way to make the process quicker and more efficient. And so basically you still memorize the basics of grammar and you memorize the most common vocabulary, and then you go and actually watch content in the language. Like you will watch anime or watch dramas or watch YouTube videos, and you watch content, and you'll recognize lots of words and grammar structures that you memorized in your study. And through seeing those in context, you can kind of use the knowledge to create intuitive understanding that will lead to acquisition. And so in refold, it's not that you memorize a word and that naturally sinks in and becomes intuitive. It's that you memorize the word. That memorized word makes the input comprehensible, and it's through comprehending the input that your unconscious mind goes through that acquisition process and you build the intuition. So it's kind of structured. It's the main thing you're doing in refold is just watching content in the language, getting lots of input, but you're leveraging study to make that process more efficient. And so basically what the process looks like is, first, like I just said, you study the vocab, you study the grammar, and then after that, you just dive into input. You watch content in the language, you listen to content and read content, and whenever you come across words that you don't know that look like valuable and on your level, then you make a flashcard for them in a spaced repetition system like Anki to memorize the meaning, and you do your reps every day. And if you use one of these programs, a spaced repetition system, then it basically has an algorithm that lets you study really efficiently so that you remember almost everything that you put into it. So that's mostly the process. Is you first focus on building your comprehension through getting lots of input and doing some study along the way to kind of speed up that process. And then once you get really good at understanding input and you've acquired the bulk of the language, you start being able to speak naturally and intuitively without worrying about grammar rules or anything like that. Kind of similar to your native language.
What is the baseline for grammar that you need to know that will, I don't know, allow you to understand the input much easier?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can definitely go in with like virtually no understanding. Mm-hmm. And like I know people who have done that. They just from day one they learned words but no grammar, and it still worked just fine. It's just kind of an uphill battle. It's kind of frustrating, right? So it's kind of, in a way, it's not really necessary. It's just more like kind of what gives you the best bang for your buck, I guess you could say, right? And I found that, for me, what I did in Japanese when I started my hardcore approach is I basically read through a rather thin, big overview of Japanese grammar. It was basically the equivalent of maybe a 50-page PDF that just covered.
Do you remember the resource?
Yeah, it was Take Him, which in hindsight, Take Him's grammar guide, it's pretty famous within the Japanese learning community. Honestly, it's not amazing in hindsight. There are certain parts of it that the explanations were kind of bad, and it kind of took me a while to like realize that they were bad. But basically, yeah, it was like the equivalent of like a 50-page PDF that just explained a broad overview of Japanese grammar. And for me, that was like all I needed. And the other thing I'll point out is that your goal in refold is to build comprehension, not to learn how to speak early on. So there's a lot of aspects of grammar that don't really help you with comprehension, and they only help you if you're trying to like come up with a sentence yourself without having the intuition. Like, for example, I'll give an example from English. So basically, if I said the red big dog, or the big red dog. Which one of those sounds like more natural to you?
Big red dog.
And do you know why that is?
Am I supposed to know right off the bat?
Most people do not know. If
Because
you did know, then I would
uh,
assume that you've studied linguistics before.
is it because in our language, I don't know, the size is usually comes first before a more detailed adjective like red or something like
Yes,
that.
actually, that's pretty
Oh,
much
actually,
it. So that's really
okay, sweet.
that's really impressive that you were able to figure that out on your own.
Oh,
But
good.
basically, there's this really complicated rule where adjectives in English have to come in a specific order, and
Mm,
I don't remember the order, but it's like color, name, size, shape. Like there's like a list of like 7 or 8 different categories, and they have to come
mm,
in that order. And that's basically what happens. So, almost
gotcha.
like even me, I've read the rule, but I don't even remember exactly what the order is. So I can't even me, I can't recite what the order is, but I can get it right unconsciously all the time because I have it in my unconscious somewhere. Like some part of my unconscious mind figured out this rule itself just by getting so much English input. But basically, if I was an English learner and I was using refold to learn English, this rule would not help my comprehension at all, right? Because basically when you're reading if I was going to read the big red dog, I was like reading an English book and it said the big red dog. Well, basically it doesn't, I don't have to know that the adjectives are in a special order or not. It's not going to allow me to understand it. To understand it, all I have to know is what big means, what red means, and what dog means. If I wanted to produce English, then I would need to know this rule so that I can put my own adjectives in the right order. But the goal with refold is that just like how native English speakers don't know the rule, by the time you've gotten enough input where you can understand English naturally, you'll have an intuition for the order and you'll be able to just
Ah,
naturally say them right, even if you don't consciously know the rule. And so
mm,
there's a lot of these rules that they're only really necessary if you want to speak yourself, and they don't really matter for comprehension. So as long as you have this perspective of like when you're reading through a grammar guide, like what's going to actually help me understand the language, there's a lot that you can throw out and you don't need.
mm. So, how would one go about learning how to speak the most efficiently and effectively, and also read the most efficiently and effectively? Is that
So
just
so those
speaking and
are
reading?
so those are two very different questions. Basically,
Hmm.
learning how to read is actually the easiest aspect of learning a language, in my opinion. So generally, people say there's 4 different skills when it comes to language learning: reading, writing, speaking, and listening comprehension. So it's basically input and output versus, and then there's the spoken language versus the written language, and that gives you like a 4 quadrant of language ability. So out of that 4 quadrants, reading, which is the understanding the written language, that's the easiest because basically when it comes to understanding spoken language tends to be very fast, right? It has like a speed built into it, unless you like slow it down on YouTube,
Yeah.
the speed control. And so a lot of times people have this problem where they will like memorize a ton of words and they might hear a sentence and they actually know all the words in the sentence, but they still can't understand it because it feels so fast and blurry that they can't even make out what they're hearing, right? That's one of the most common problems that people have when they're learning a language. And so when you're talking about reading, that's not a problem because all the words are right there on the page. You can go at your own speed. There's no issue of like someone slurring their speech so you can't make out what they're saying anymore. And so yeah, reading is generally the easiest skill. And then after that, listening and then speaking, or and then writing and then speaking is actually the hardest. Writing's also easier because you can take your time and go as much time as you need, right? And
Yeah.
pronunciation is irrelevant. Whereas with speaking, you have to actually pronounce the language, get your tongue and mouth working in the right way, and then also if it's a conversation, you have to like be doing it on a real time, right, with no time lag, basically. And so reading, it's pretty much just the process of if you want to get good at reading, just practice reading a lot, look up the words you don't know, and just keep doing that over and over. And that's how
Mm.
you'll get good at reading. Generally, it's good to start with easier material, like material that's either meant specifically for learners at the very beginning, like simplified material, or you can use material that's meant for kids. But don't go too hard on that because, reading picture books, you can only do that so much as an adult.
Yeah.
So my preference is actually to read something that's actually above my level, but I'm really interested in. So
Yeah.
I would read manga that was too hard for me right from the beginning, but because I cared about it, I was willing to push through and stick with it. So that's
Yeah.
my personal preference, but I think that's more an issue of like preference rather than like better or worse type of thing.
Yeah. So I'm interested. I know I've heard the answer to this somewhere, but I forgot. I think it'd be interesting to have the audience hear about it. But I've heard that anime is really bad for comprehension because, that's not how native speakers actually sound.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to that?
So basically, anime is like 95% exactly the same as all of the rest of Japanese. And there's like 5% of like anime like spice that
Yeah.
is makes it unique. And so like for example, if you took like I mentioned earlier that if you take the 300 most common words that covers 80% of all words used, like it's the same exact 300 words whether you're talking about anime versus real life. And it's even the same if you created a frequency list of all the words, they'd be like 95% overlap between the two. There'd be a couple words like ninja and like kamehameha or whatever that like don't actually show up in real life, but those are actually a small minority. And all the grammar is the same with just like a couple differences. So for the most part, like what will actually happen if you learn Japanese from anime is at first you'll sound like an anime character, and then very quickly you'll learn how to like shift your speech to sound natural. Like literally
Gotcha.
you could, I think in the most extreme case, you could take somebody that learned Japanese only through anime and then reached fluency, dump them in Japan, and within like 2 weeks I'm pretty sure they'll figure out how to speak naturally, right? They'll quickly learn.
Hmm.
And the other
Hmm.
thing is that anime is actually very broad, right? Like the anime that's used in like Dragon Ball Z is a lot less realistic than the anime that's used in Death Note, right? The Japanese
Yeah.
that's used in Death Note is actually very realistic, right? Because
Hmm.
it goes along with the overall the vibe of the show is pretty realistic, right?
Yeah.
And just like the behavior of the characters and such. And so even just through watching anime, you'll get a sense of like which words are only used in like fantastical shows like JoJo and which words are used in shows that are more realistic that are just about like high schoolers going to school or this type of thing. And
Mm.
so yeah, if you like literally only learn Japanese from watching Bleach, you'd sound really weird. But if you watch like a holistic anime diet, then that alone you'll end up with like 99% natural Japanese.
I love that term, holistic anime diet. That's great. Oh man, I'm gonna start using that. So you mentioned speaking. I feel like that I haven't gotten into reading yet, but I feel like that's what bugs me is when like because I can comprehend stuff, and then when I think about trying to speak something very very similar, it's like it doesn't come out of my
Yeah,
mouth. Like I
yeah.
just don't like what is the solution?
So the biggest
Just
solution,
speaking more.
the solution is that you need more input. That's the core
Mm.
solution. It's basically the way I think about it is, when you were a kid, you'd see a commercial so many times that you became able to recite the whole thing, even though you never even tried to memorize it.
Yeah.
And you can probably still recite some of those to this day.
Hmm.
That is basically what you want the whole language to feel like. Like when you get enough input, it starts to feel like that, where basically what you want to do when you're starting to speak, it's a little bit of a different process. You don't want to like let's say you wanted to say I need to go to the bathroom. Right? That's what we say in English. So what a lot of people do when they try to like speak Japanese is they literally say, okay, how do I literally say I need to go to the bathroom in Japanese? And then they might come up with something like toire ni iku hitsuyou ga aru or something, right? Which literally means like there exists a necessity for me to go to the bathroom. And that's extremely unnatural in Japanese. They'll know what you
Hmm.
mean, but it would just sound really weird.
Hmm.
So what you want to do instead is say, okay, what does a Japanese person say when they want to go to the bathroom or they need to go to the bathroom? And then what you realize is they say something like toire ikitai, which literally would mean I want to go to the bathroom, right? Instead of need, they say I would like to go to the bathroom type of thing.
Hmm.
And then you just say that. So it's kind of like you want to query your brain and say like, okay, I've listened to Japanese people speak Japanese for like over 1,000 hours, maybe a couple thousand hours. When a Japanese person wants to express this idea, how do they express it? And you gotta kind of like think meta like that, because a lot of times it's pretty different. Like for example, in English, we might say like, hey, do you know where my phone is? Or actually, sorry, I'm like thinking in Japanese. We would say in English, uh, hey, have you seen my phone? That's like the most common way to say it. Like, hey, I lost my phone. Have you seen my phone? That's the most common way to say it. In Japanese, they literally say like, keitai shiranai, which literally means like, do you know my phone? Is basically what it means. And so that's totally different, right? So if you're thinking in English and you're trying to just translate your English thought, like, have you seen my phone? If you said that in Japanese, like, have you seen my phone? They'd be like, yeah, I've seen your phone. It's an iPhone, right? Be like, no, no, no. Like, have you seen it recently? Like, where is it?
Mm-hmm.
It would
Mm-hmm.
mean something totally different. So it's really about kind of taking a step back and thinking meta and thinking like, what's the base idea underneath what I want to say, and what does a Japanese person say in that type of situation? And as long as
Mm-hmm.
you've gotten enough input, it should be just like how you can recite the commercial. It just pops into your mind because you've seen it so many times.
So apart from the refold method and checking out your website, what other resources could the listeners use to start practicing what you preach a lot, or is most of it you wanting to tell them, well, listen to, watch things that you enjoy the most to make it enjoyable?
Yeah, well, one really helpful thing that you can do is watch Japanese content with Japanese subtitles. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that we recommend a lot at Refold. And that way you can kind of improve your listening and your reading at the same time, and they can kind of like help each other out.
Yeah.
So, you can if you're learning, the Japanese characters, the kanji characters, and seeing the characters can give you a big hint as to what people are saying because they have meaning. And also, if there's a word that you know how it's pronounced but you don't know the characters, when you're watching it with subtitles, you can hear it and then see how it's written. So you can kind of like use the two, reading and listening, to kind of reinforce the two skills together. And so that's a really good way. And there's actually software out now. Like the most popular one is called Language Reactor, which is like a extension that you can install into your browser like Chrome for free and watch Netflix, and it will give you the ability to basically hover over any word and instantly like get the lookup of what it means. And so
Wow.
I think that, and it has a lot of other features, like you can have it pause after each subtitle line automatically, so you can go through it at your own pace. And they have a whole suite of features. So that it would be a really good place to start. Like basically,
Awesome.
the right now the best language learning resource is actually Netflix. Right? It's not actually anything made for language learning. Netflix, like if you had nothing but Netflix, like you took someone, you locked them in a room, and they had nothing but a computer that could watch Netflix, eventually they could become fluent in any language that Netflix supports like content for, I think.
And then also Anki, you said, right?
Yeah, Anki definitely speeds things up a bit. Anki is basically the most popular spaced repetition system, and that's what I mentioned a little bit ago, where basically you make your own flashcards in Anki. It's not like Anki comes with a curriculum or anything. It's just basically a blank slate where you make your own flashcards, and Anki, when you review the flashcards in Anki, every card has a front and a back. So you see the front of the card, which might be I recommend making cards that have an example sentence on the front rather than just a single word, because that makes it more natural to learn. And so you have the example sentence on the front that uses the word you want to learn, and then the meaning on the back. So you test your comprehension of the sentence, and then Anki will have these options of like again, hard, good, easy. And so you actually tell Anki how well you remembered the flashcard, and it uses that feedback to decide when the next time you should view the card is. And so it uses this algorithm to basically schedule your cards for you. And what happens is over time, there's this thing called the forgetting curve, which basically means that in order to retain your memory of something, as you start to have that sink deeper and deeper into your memory, you need to review it less and less. So Anki will show you a card like at first once a day, and then once every 3 days, and then once every week, and then once every 2 weeks, and then once every month, and it grows exponentially until eventually you only need to see that card once a year or once every 3 years. Like I actually stopped using my main Anki deck a couple of years ago, but at the time I had cards that said like your next review for this card will literally be in like 2040 and like stuff like that, because
Yeah.
that's how the
Yeah.
exponential growth works. And so it's
Right.
really
Right.
efficient because like actually what I personally did was I made 10 Anki cards every day for about 10 years. And in order to retain this, I ended up having about like between 70 and 80 reviews every day. So I'd spend like about an hour to an hour and a half every day on Anki reviewing and making new cards. And what this eventually led to was that after 5 years, I had over 15,000 cards. And I basically had caught up my vocabulary to that of a native speaker, or really close, so that I could read novels no problem. And actually, to this day, I know a lot of words that natives don't know because I would read these old, difficult novels. I'd memorize all these words. And so that's like one of my kind of special abilities is I can impress native speakers by, knowing words that they don't know, or knowing some rare word that they would never expect a foreigner to know, and stuff like that.
Awesome. So you seem to be extremely disciplined about language learning. I don't know how you are in other areas of your life in regards to applying the same sort of discipline. Is there some sort of underlying principle or principles that you try to apply to anything else you're trying to get better at or stay consistent about? Like, is there something that just universally applies to improving oneself that you tell yourself or do a lot?
Well, honestly, when it comes to discipline, I would say I'm pretty average. I'm not just like some amazing stoic, hero or anything. I mean, for me in Japanese now, mostly what I focus on is controlling my environment. And so, for example, on I have the YouTube app on my phone, but on my whenever I watch YouTube on my phone, I should step back. Actually, I have multiple YouTube accounts. And I have one YouTube account where I only watch Japanese videos. And because I've only ever watched Japanese YouTube videos on this account, the YouTube algorithm thinks that I only understand Japanese. So I only get recommended Japanese videos on that account. So on my phone, I only log into that YouTube account. And so when I open up YouTube, the only videos that show up are Japanese videos on all the homepage and the recommended page. So basically, no matter what I watch on my phone on YouTube, I'm automatically getting Japanese input, even if it's some stupid video or whatever. And of course, sometimes I want to watch English YouTube. So I have a separate account for watching English YouTube videos that I log into on my computer, but I have an extension on Chrome that hides all the recommended videos. So to watch a video, I have to specifically search for it or specifically go to someone's channel and select it. And I don't even see any of the recommended videos ever. So the only time YouTube recommends me a video is if it's in Japanese, basically. So this is a way for me to kind of like effortlessly, like basically the only time I will go down a YouTube rabbit hole is if I'm also getting better at Japanese in the process. So that's like kind of how I've set it up. And so
Mhm.
most of the time, that's kind of how I have things set up. Like also in general, I don't, when I can, I like to actually download things and watch them locally rather than watch on Netflix because I don't like how Netflix like recommends me a bunch of stuff and things like that. And so, yeah, I try to control my environment in this way. And then I will set a small amount of time every day where I will like do things like make the flashcards and actually study. But that's only a small portion of the day. And generally, I enjoy doing things like making the flashcards because I'm excited in general about getting better at Japanese. And so the flashcards are always something that I kind of look forward to. It's like a very concrete way that I can know that I'm making gains and growing my ability. And so, yeah, I guess for me, it's kind of just a matter of experimenting with what works, making it as easy as possible, designing your environment so that it's more of a downhill than an uphill type of battle.
Yeah.
But I still have my own struggles with discipline. I'm not definitely not a hero or anything.
Hmm. On those days where you really don't want to do the daily work, what do you tell yourself?
Well, sometimes actually I will like watch a video of me speaking Japanese, and then that will just make me wish I was so much better than I was. Because
Mm.
we're all our harshest critic, and so
Yeah.
when I listen to myself speak Japanese, I always hone in on every single little tiny mistake, and I'm like, oh, I can't believe I said that. Oh, I can't believe I said that. And so that's always a good way to kind of like kick me into gear. But sometimes I'll take the opposite approach where I will like try to make a new Japanese friend or talk to a new Japanese person. And when I see like how excited they are to talk to me because I'm fluent in Japanese and they've clearly like never met a foreigner who's like that fluent, that also makes me feel like, oh yeah, this is a really cool thing that I'm excited about and want to keep going. So in Japanese, there's a phrase, the candy and the whip, where you want to reward yourself positive motivation, and then with the candy, and then you also whip yourself with the negative motivation. Combine both together, and that's a good way
Mm.
to stay consistent, I guess.
Yeah. Combo of positive and negative reinforcement. And it's interesting you brought up, changing your environment and switching different YouTube accounts. I talk about this a lot on my channel, and a concept that I've been writing about too is it's very easy for one to get caught in a bubble online where the algorithm keeps
Mm-hmm.
recommending you the same content. So that shifts your beliefs to whatever the algorithm recommends you, and that kind of turns you into the type of person that the algorithm thinks you are.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, you can consciously do that to start changing yourself to the person that
Yeah,
you want to
have the
become.
algorithm make
To,
you into a Japanese person.
yes, exactly. And changing your identity is so much about changing what you're consuming on a daily basis, which will change your thoughts and how you act, and creating things in your external environment as well that make it easier for you to become that identity that you're trying to become. It definitely took a while for me to change my beliefs into like, I am a YouTuber.
Mm.
I am I'm a fitness guy. But once I saw the feedback I was getting from completing the things at the start, when it was like kind of shaky, is like, I don't know if this is right for me. I don't know if this is going to be me. Once I got the feedback and like my behaviors were in line with that, what I thought that identity was like, then I was like, okay, this is working. I am becoming this. I am this. And you convince yourself eventually. And you were kind of describing that process in a way with language learning. So super cool. One last question.
Yeah.
Which is going to be interesting for you to answer, because I feel like the majority of people I have on this podcast are more so in like the entrepreneur business, self-improvement type of stuff. So for you, when you think of the word successful, who's the first person that comes to your mind and why?
Oh no. I hate the person that just came to mind when you said that.
Who was it?
I think the first person that just popped into my mind was Gary Vaynerchuk, but I don't look up to him as a model of success at all.
Yeah.
I think that's just an association between the type of people who, that word and then who I associate with that word. But yeah, I very much don't aspire to be like that at all.
Yeah.
Actually, I had a period of my life where I felt that maybe I should try to be like that, because there's a lot of pressure from society of like,
for sure,
what life is a game, and to win the game you have to be as rich as possible and have as much stuff as possible and have as many followers as possible. And so I definitely had that pressure for a long time, until I eventually just realized that it just wasn't me and wasn't what I wanted to do, especially with running a business. Like I've started to go in the direction of starting what may become a bigger business a couple times. And what I realized is it's not really what I want to do. I would rather have a very small business where I really run everything myself and have like a smaller number of customers. And I have total control. I can really be creative about things, and I don't have to worry too much about, optimizing for profits and things like that. And that's just what I want to do. And so I'm okay pursuing that rather than doing something that, might be more flashy or ultimately make me more money or something.
Mm-hmm. I feel the same way, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I feel about YouTube. Is like, would I ever want to build a massive company, have a bunch of employees? That sounds like so much work. And then, there's people getting not paid properly and things get corrupt and yada, yada. It's like, let's keep things small, things I can control. And like, I have the full freedom.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about it as well. That's why I enjoy YouTube. The freedom that comes with that.
Yeah, definitely. Like I like creating things more than managing other people.
Right.
In fact, managing other people is frustrating for me because I'm a perfectionist and I want it done like exactly how I see it in my head. And I'm always the type of like, I tried working with an editor a bunch of times, and I probably will in the future, but it's always just like, oh no, give me that. I'll just do it myself.
Yeah.
Like, that's not my vision.
My God, dude. I'm exactly the same. And I actually just hired an editor a few months ago, and like I try to give him the most exact notes possible because I have a vision for what I want. It's like it's got to be implemented exactly like this. I will say though, it's helped me free up so much of my time. Highly recommend it, even if you are like that.
No, I know.
I am like that. I know. But that's a conversation for another day. Matt, thank you so much for doing this. Do you want to shout out your social medias and all the resources where people can find you?
Yeah. Well, so I have my YouTube channel, Matt vs. Japan. I'm also on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter at Matt vs. Japan. I have an Instagram as well, Matt vs. Japan _ where I'm not quite as active. But YouTube channel is definitely my main platform. And yeah, thanks so much for having me on. This was really fun, and you asked really good questions.
Arigatou gozaimasu.
Yeah, こちらこそ.
Or is it that, or is it when you finish something? Because I've heard people say arigatou gozaimashita.
In this case, it would be arigatou gozaimasu, because your
cool.
Arigatou gozaimashita would be like that's a hard nuance to explain. But anyway.
Okay, that's all good. Thank you, man. Appreciate it. And yeah, that is it. Have a good rest of your day.
Too.